Union Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Shri Pradhanji, Minister of Health, Odisha, Shri Nayak, Conclave Coordinator, Shri Jagdanand, Vice Chairman, CII Odisha, Dr. Tapan Kumar Chand, distinguished guests, friends, and members of the media. First of all, my great thanks to Shri Pradhanji for inviting me to the conclave today. I've known Dharmendra Pradhanji since I arrived here in New Delhi in January 2015, and he's been most kind to me. I've also found that he is incredibly passionate about Odisha, but what I found today, the kind of passion he has when he speaks in Oriya is quite a different experience. I don't understand Oriya language, although let me say that, my name sometimes, well actually not sometimes, but most of the times get confused with Panagariya, and therefore I am taken for an Oriya, but I get pretty quickly exposed when people then try to communicate to me in Oriya, and I'm sort of dumbfounded. It really, as I was saying, I did not understand most of what the minister was saying, but the passion certainly I could feel quite deeply. So those of you who do understand the language, I'm sure, had a fantastic experience, even more fantastic than I did. I'm sure the minister has already told you quite a lot, at least from some of the things that I could understand. He has given you a fantastic journey. He has taken you through a fantastic journey of what Prime Minister Modi has been doing and what is to come. And I will only be complimenting both with an E and I what the minister has said. First of all, I think, picking up on one of the key themes that he developed, that he discussed, let me also say that, the days when states used to look up to the central government are rapidly getting behind us. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, states typically looked for guidance to the center. And I know that when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister, he would write a monthly letter to each chief minister providing guidance on what they might want to do in the states. I think now the situation is turning around. States have taken charge, and the central government under Prime Minister Modi has been very quick to recognize that reality. Indeed, under the 14th Finance Commission, the devolution of the shareable revenues was increased from 32 to 40%. There was a big, huge change. Partly, I suspect that the Finance Commission team itself saw where Prime Minister Modi was heading when it made that particular recommendation. But it also took Prime Minister Modi no time to accept that recommendation wholeheartedly. He had argued in a variety of ways that states ought to be empowered when he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat, and that thought stayed with him when he became the Prime Minister. He also, in a way, the replacing of the Planning Commission by the Niti Aayog is a part of that same cooperative federalism spirit that he has fostered. Evidently, under the Planning Commission used to, the extra 10% that was added by the 14th Finance Commission to the devolution, part of that money was used to be dispersed by the Planning Commission. And while I had never visited the Planning Commission before, except in the late 1980s, when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, I'm told that the corridors of the Planning Commission used to be filled with the chief ministers and the ministers from the states, because the Planning Commission used to give this money, and Planning Commission often sat in judgment over the states. It made decisions on what projects the states could do and projects the states could not do. But today, that is no longer the case. Niti Aayog corridors are, if anything, there with either the corporates or the civil society representatives, not the chief ministers or ministers of the states. So the discourse between the Niti Aayog and the states now is of a very different kind. Chief ministers don't come to the states. I typically go to the states with ideas. Now, Niti Aayog is a think tank. It has to earn its living by creating ideas, by promoting ideas, and of course, most importantly, Niti Aayog has to study the successful experiments that different states are doing, and therefore the best practices that the states develop, and then diffuse them to the other states. So this is one of the things we have been doing while interacting with the states. Recently, we have even brought out a book which documents a series of best practices from different states in different areas, and the book is just to be released, which we will be sending out to the chief ministers and the chief secretaries of the states very soon. So now under Prime Minister Modi, we have what he calls the Team India. The governing body of the Niti Aayog includes not just the representatives of the central government. Prime Minister, of course, is the chairman of Niti Aayog, and several of the senior cabinet members are members of the governing body of the Niti Aayog. But most importantly now, chief ministers of all the states and lieutenant governors of some of the UTs are also full members of the Niti Aayog. So therefore, it truly brings the states and the central government together on a single platform, and that again is part of the spirit of cooperative federalism that the Prime Minister has fostered. So let me say the Honorable Minister had said that we hold this in some form. We bring this conclave or at least some of the conclusions and lessons that the conclave derives to New Delhi also, and we'll certainly be very happy to do that. That is a part of our mandate. We work with the states, and this will be truly a first for us, actually, because it's not that we are coming to the states, but states will come to New Delhi, and that is an incredibly welcome development for the Niti Aayog. Let me also say, as the Minister had correctly surmised, that this is really the first time I'm on the dais with civil society, the corporates, and of course representatives of the government. With that, let me just say a few things about some of the themes. After all, I'm not just the Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, but I'm also an economist, and I thought I'll share with some of my thoughts as an economist as well. I looked through the list of various subjects that are going to be discussed at the conclave, and those are all eminently sensible subjects, very important ones, ones that touch the people, whether it be in area of health, area of education, livelihood, etc. These are all issues that touch the people directly, and therefore very much very important for the conclave to discuss, see how we can make progress going forward in these different areas. However, let me mention one very important subject which also should be on the agenda of the conclave, which at least in the listing I have not seen, but it is very, very important. Indeed, it is the backbone of everything else that you want to do, and that is the subject of growth. We have often kind of neglected, I think, paying the attention to growth that growth deserves. Why? Because in the end, all the social programs that you are going to discuss, now we heard actually from the representative of the social, of the civil society that, there's not enough in the budget to be spent on education, there's not enough in the budget to be spent on health, there's not enough to be spent in the budget on livelihoods. But remember where the revenues are going to come from. In the end, revenues come from taxes that are paid on the income. If the income base itself is very low, taxes you're going to generate will also be low, and therefore the expenditures on the various social programs that the government will be able to do will also be low. In the end, all the development expenditures that the states, that the government do, both the central government and the state governments, depend very heavily on the level of GDP, which determines how much tax revenue can be collected. So growth is very important from that point of view, but also do not underestimate the value of growth that comes directly. When economies grow rapidly, they create jobs, they raise wages, and that directly empowers people. When people's wages are sufficiently high, when their own incomes are high, they are much more empowered. Then not only they can provide themselves the daily needs, which is from food, clothing, and shelter to the other things, but also their own ability to access the public services improves. So, if the government provides health services, but I don't have enough income to be able to take a bus to the primary health care center, which might be in the village next door, I cannot access those services. So therefore, increase in the people's incomes is also a very important part of empowerment, which allows them to access the publicly provided social services. In fact, Odisha's own experience, actually Odisha grew rather rapidly from 2003-04 to 2009-10, and that is also the period during which India itself grew about over 8%. Odisha grew even faster than that, and it is on the back of that growth that actually the development expenditures in Odisha could grow much more rapidly. And let us not forget that on the one hand, again I heard this from the earlier speakers, that the poverty levels in Odisha are extremely high, which is correct. Actually, you can look up the data in our poverty line. The Tendulkar line that we use is a relatively modest poverty line, and even by that, the poverty levels in Odisha are very high, the general poverty levels as well as the poverty levels among the scheduled tribes, among the scheduled castes. But let us also not forget that the poverty levels today are far lower than what they were even in 2004-05. Actually, tremendous progress has been made in combating poverty, in bringing poverty down. I could actually give you some figures. 2004-05, the overall aggregate, in the entire population, rural plus urban, poverty rate in Odisha was about 58%. Today, it's about 33%. So we have seen some progress, actually considerable progress, from coming down from about 58% down to 33%. That is a substantial progress we have actually made here. And you can look at the other groups also. Among scheduled tribes, it was excessive in 2004-05, as late as 2004-05. 82%, 83% of the scheduled tribes families were actually below the poverty line. That did come down by 2011-12 to 62.5%. Still a very high figure, but certainly progress nonetheless. And for that, we do have growth to thank. So please do pay attention. Growth is extremely important. One further point on that is another way to think of it is the following, that what we need to do, because growth ultimately is not for the sake of growth. I mentioned that it gives you more revenues, therefore the government's ability to combat poverty and other social problems improves. But also, growth is supposed to create employment. Now here, I must say that our success has been limited, both nationally as well as in Odisha. The success in creating employment opportunities, creating jobs, has been rather limited. And here are some data which will explain to you what the problem is. This is also roughly, I'm going to give you the numbers for the data for Odisha, but actually this is also the state of affairs at the national level. So in Odisha now, agriculture produces about 18 to 20% of the GDP or GSDP, gross state domestic product. But this is the latest figures we have. These relate to 2011-12 because the National Sample Survey Office does these surveys about every 5 years. So the last one we have is from 11-12 on employment. But agriculture employs about 56% of the workers in Odisha. So 56% of the workers employed in agriculture are producing about 18.7% of the GSDP. That's lots of people on too little output. And no wonder, therefore, we know that where the poor are concentrated, they're concentrated in agriculture. It's simply, that is what is reflected in the data, that look, when 57% of the workforce lives on about 18 to 19% of the output, that is a lot of poverty there. On the other hand, industry in Odisha actually does much better than in most other states. And the share of industry in Odisha has been about 27-28%. Here, however, the employment figures are low. Actually, only 11% of the workforce is employed in industry. This is again 2011-12 figures. So this is an imbalance because industry, although it generates a lot of value added, a lot of output it generates, but it doesn't generate as much employment as it should be. And this is a national problem. This is really a national problem that when it comes to job creation, and so this is something for my colleague here from CII to think about, that when it comes to entrepreneurship, our entrepreneurs, our corporate leaders often end up going into highly capital intensive industries. It's a labor intensive industry that has not done well in India, and by which one means clothing, food processing, electronic industry, light manufacturers of all kinds. This is where China, and before China in the 60s and 70s, South Korea, Taiwan, etc. did very well. And really, if you look at these very successful countries, about 3 or 4 of them from East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, initially in the 60s and 70s, China in the last 2 to 3 decades. These countries really, in effect, eliminated poverty almost without any anti-poverty programs. What they did was to create jobs, employment opportunities by specializing in these very labor-intensive industries and exporting to the world markets in large volumes. And that, of course, provided employment. So not only output share of the agriculture actually declined in these countries during this fast growth period, but also workers moved out of agriculture into gainful employment in industry and services. That movement in India has been awfully slow. That is something we again need to do. In Odisha, as far as I understand, some of the little bit of study I did, clearly one industry which could do this very successfully is food processing. Clearly, there is a lot of fertile land, and Odisha is one of the largest producers of things like fruits and vegetables. These can then be processed into processed food, which in turn actually provide good jobs as well. So that is one industry, but there is no reason why Odisha also should not be a large producer of clothing, for example, which can then export, electronic industry and so forth. These are all industries that provide good jobs and can then provide the transition of the workers. Today, India-wide, for example, 47% of India's farms are smaller than half hectare. Now, no family of 4 or 5 can earn a living on such a small farm, and about 47% of our farms are of that size. So clearly we need jobs to be created in alternative employments, industry and services, and that is the pitch which I am making. Odisha also has one big advantage of very large coastline. And most countries that have grown rapidly, most countries that have transformed, have actually made big use of their coastal areas. You can look at Singapore, you can look at South Korea, you can look at Taiwan, but above all, even China, which has a huge hinterland, which has a huge space inside, but much of the Chinese growth actually came from coast. The companies located on the coast imported inputs from abroad, use the Chinese workers to process them and export it back. That's a process in some of the Indian states is now underway, in Gujarat, in Andhra Pradesh. I think Odisha has the Paradip port, seems to me is a fantastic port. It's a deep draft port which can bring in ships that can carry large containers and so therefore can facilitate the kind of industrialization, employment creating industrialization that some of these other countries that I have mentioned have done. Some of the states within India, Andhra Pradesh and Gujarat, are doing. So I think that's something to consider. Finally, let me say one last, put out one last thought, that in India, generally, I think, in terms of our expenditure on social programs, I think we have been very diffused. What we have done is to start far too many different programs. And what that does is to dilute the resources. When you're trying to do too many things, the impact kind of tends to dilute. Also, focus tends to get lost. What most of the successful countries that I've mentioned did largely is, one, they focused on employment generating growth, and second, they focused in a big way on education. If you go back like South Korea, for example, even when it was relatively poor in the 1960s, by late 1960s, South Korea had achieved literacy rates of close to about 90%. So I think this is where we ought to make a truly, truly big push. We should really take this in a mission mode, set ourselves the goal of near 100% literacy maybe within next 10 years or so. But this is where I think the greatest returns are. This is where growth and social spending, education and growth, they are self-reinforcing. Because remember that if people are educated, and if people have some minimum level of income, and if the government provides the basic infrastructure, roads, electricity, water, sanitation, then people themselves can figure quite a lot on themselves, a lot on their own. I think our approach has been a little bit not trusting the beneficiary. At the end of the day, beneficiary himself or herself knows what is good for him or good for her. And I think, if we can empower them with higher incomes, we can empower them with better education. So both, I mean, not just quantity, I mentioned that, taking literacy to 100%, but also the quality of education is very important. I think that has been a major lacuna in our system. Also, vocational education has to be part of that educational push as well. But if we can really do that and then provide the basic infrastructure, connectivity to the people, I think there's a lot else that people can figure on their own. So on that note, let me thank you all again. Let me thank Minister Pradhan for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arvind ji, and for sharing some some of your thoughts, but I still think tribal development requires some special attention, and at some stage we would like to have a very clear track on the tribal development in this country, and especially in Odisha. With this, I will request Dr. Tapan Chand, the CMD of NALCO, to offer concluding remarks and a vote of thanks to everybody on behalf of the corporate world. Dr. Chand. Dr. Chand, good a second. I just wanted to check with you because Dr. Panagariya will leave. Dharmendraji, we are requesting him to spend some time. Would you have any questions, one or two questions to Dr. Panagariya? Because I would not like, if you have some questions, if I can see some hands, 1, 2 hands, you have a question. Anybody else? One second. I can only take 2, 3 questions actually. One from here. Yes. Microphone tika deveki. We'll take 2 questions, sir. Otherwise, they will feel restless. Yes. Micro. No, I'll give you the floor, sir. One moment. I will give you the floor. Pachar diyantu. There is one. Then I'll give you the floor.
Dr. Panagariya is famous for his theme on international trade.
Silence. Hello.
But nowadays, recently, it has been found out that international trade or growth in international trade is no more the panacea for growth. Do you admit it, sir?
Okay. We'll take the second question. Second question here. Yeah, one more question. Second question here. Then I will give you the floor. Yes.
Somewhere in the whole presentation of Dr. Panagariya,
Closer.
I work with Adivasis for the last 40 years, right? And I've debated in my mind, in our whole model, we're not looking at essentially the extraction not just of surplus of labor, but you're looking at extraction of even the basic needs for survival. That allows for wealth. The wealth is created by people who work, and the more difficult the work is, that is what creates wealth. But you have to keep them in a state of poverty, otherwise you will not get them to do that work. And this is the issue with all tribal communities. The kind of extraction of labor and extraction not just of surplus, but extraction of even the basic necessities that they need for their own survival is what is generating wealth on the one hand and creating continuously poverty in tribal areas.
Thank you. And the last one here, and then I will give you the floor. Okay. Not
But
so
this
many.
is-
I'll take 2 more and then we'll close. Yes.
Yeah, in fact, this is in continuation
Hello.
with my
Yes, silence.
previous speakers. I just would like to highlight how inclusive this growth would be when we are talking about the industrialization and also, like enriching that kind of things. Which population are we actually targeting? Are we really taking the entire state into consideration and talking about it, or this is just a cream of people who are going to be benefited? And the concern that civil society is always having, the gap between the rich and poor, how are you going to address that?
The last one here. Yes. Eti tika debe microphone ta. Eti diyantu. Camera pachare. Say it. 80 diyantu. Right, I would like some questions on Odisha actually.
Yes.
Right, let us not get into the whole world and Odisha, Adivasi issues, the disaster issues which we are dealing. Yes.
Hello. Sir, whatever schemes are formulated at center and the states, it should have a monitoring and evaluation modules. I feel without these modules, we do not get the feedback whatever the schemes is being implemented. And these things should be designed by Niti Aayog, should be given to state or center should monitor this. So these modules for governance should be formulated. That's my
Okay.
proposal.